It's been 30 days since Uranus first appeared in the sky. At first, it looked like our moon had found itself a stellar partner. But then we understood something much, much bigger was headed our way. What caused Uranus to become so unstable? How could this epic collision change the ice giant? Oh, and what's this horrific stink? Ugh! This is What If, and here's what would happen if Uranus collided with Earth. Let's roll back 30 days, when things were still normal. Uranus lived a quiet life on the outskirts of our solar system, about 3 billion kilometers away from us. And then suddenly, it began to move closer. Astronomers would be the first to push the panic button. By their calculations, it would take Uranus 13 years to reach the collision point. We'd be short on time, but at least we'd have a slight chance to evacuate the Earth. But the cold blue giant had other plans in mind. This would be no standard planetary drill. Planets don't just take off from their orbits for no reason at all, but somehow Uranus did. Now it would be hurtling through the solar system, ramping up to a speed of around 1,000 kilometers per second. Because of this unexpectedly fast speed, we'd only have about 30 days left on this planet. Uranus would shine like a bright blue star in the sky, and every day it would appear bigger and brighter. Our sky would look gorgeous, not only because of the ice giant shining down on us, but also thanks to many shooting stars. Only those wouldn't be stars at all. To get to the Earth's orbit, Uranus would have to pass an asteroid belt between Jupiter and Mars. This would disrupt the stable orbits of many asteroids and throw some of them our way. These asteroids can be as big as 240 kilometers in diameter. That's a few times larger than the one responsible for wiping dinosaurs off the face of the Earth about 65 million years ago. We would have nowhere to go. We'd just be left here, watching the end of times unfold in front of our eyes. Might as well enjoy the view. By the time the first asteroids appeared as shooting stars, Uranus would look about the same size as the Moon, but it would be growing rapidly as it moved ever closer. While you'd be here awaiting humanity's doom, Uranus would start shaking things up. Because Uranus is about 15 times more massive than the Earth, its gravitational pull would start massively affecting our planet. Volcanoes would begin erupting uncontrollably, and tremendous earthquakes would get in on the act, destroying the Earth from the inside. And the stink. You'd drop unconscious from even one whiff of it because, well, Uranus smells like farts. The ice giant's upper atmosphere is mostly composed of hydrogen sulfide. It's the same stuff that makes rotten eggs reek so bad. Imagine an entire planet of rotten eggs engulfing the Earth. Blech! The thought of it makes me nauseous. But Uranus wouldn't come alone. It would bring all of its 27 moons along for the ride. And those moons would be hitting the Earth from all sides. As a fart-filled finale, Uranus would compress what was left of our atmosphere, and the rapidly rising temperatures would ignite it. Just like that, our beautiful blue planet would fall in line and start circling the ice giant, eventually becoming one of its many moons. Uranus wouldn't get away with this assault so easily, however. Last time it collided with another planetary object twice the size of Earth, it tipped over. Yeah, Uranus is the only planet in our neighborhood that spins on its side. This impact, featuring our earthly home, could help tilt it back to how it once was. But for the Earth, we know that would be it. If by some unexplained mystery, life on Earth's stinking leftovers emerged once again, we would see the blue of Uranus on the horizon. Would you sleep in this earthquake-proof bed? It senses when an earthquake is happening and drops you into a safe metal chamber. Yeah, we know how ridiculous this looks. But desperate times call for desperate measures. Because we're about to experience the most powerful earthquake in history. A magnitude 20. How much damage would it cause? Would it break our planet into pieces? And what could cause such a massive earthquake? This is What If, and here's what would happen if a magnitude 20 earthquake hits. To understand just how big a magnitude 20 earthquake would be, let's take a look at the Richter scale. The Richter scale is a logarithmic scale that rates the amount of energy released by an earthquake. What does logarithmic mean? Well, in this case, it means that the amount of energy released increases 31.7 times between whole number values on the scale. For example, a 2.0 quake is 32 times as energetic as a 1.0 event. And a 3.0 quake is 1,000 times more powerful than a 1.0 event. The largest earthquake ever recorded registered a magnitude of 9.5, and it caused about $5 billion in damage. It killed 16 people. Would we have to evacuate the planet? To properly prepare for an earthquake this big, we need to understand what causes earthquakes in general. Earthquakes are vibrations that travel through volcanic eruptions and meteor impacts, but the movement of tectonic plates is what usually causes them. These plates, which make up the Earth's crust, can slide against each other at a region called the transform boundary. When the plates move indifferent, the forces of the Earth will continue to push against them and increase the pent-up energy and pressure. When the pressure builds up enough, it will overcome the friction and result in an intense and sudden shift. This causes the vibration we know as an earthquake, and the longer the fault line, the more massive the earthquake. So, how long of a fault line would be required to produce a magnitude 20 earthquake? Well, let's put it this way. To produce a magnitude 10.5 earthquake, you'd need a fault line of about 80,000 kilometers. And given that the Earth's circumference is only about 40,000 kilometers, that would be highly unlikely. With all that considered, a magnitude 20 earthquake seems pretty impossible. So there's nothing to worry about. Oh right, except for that. One way that a magnitude 20 earthquake could occur would be due to a massive asteroid impact. An earthquake this large would last longer than any earthquake we've ever experienced. You would feel the shaking for at least 5 minutes, and aftershocks would go on for hours. Tsunamis and volcanic eruptions would be taking place. More earthquakes would likely be triggered, and the whole world would be falling apart. Literally. For the power of this earthquake to destroy the planet, it would need to overcome something called the gravitational binding energy. which describes the minimum value a spherical and uniform object needs to keep together under the influence of gravity. Now, we won't go into specific values here because we don't want to make things any more complicated, so we'll leave it at this. We're screwed. A magnitude 20 earthquake would produce more than enough energy to overcome the gravitational binding energy and destroy our planet. But the good news is that we would likely see the massive asteroid coming and would have time to prepare for everything that comes with it. The sun is releasing massive spurts of energy that are headed directly toward Earth. And if they hit us, it could change everything. Power grids could be wiped out. Our communications could cease to exist. Humanity might be put back into the Stone Age. All because of a solar storm. But what makes them so powerful? How is it possible for something like this to happen in 2024? And why are they so dangerous? This is What If, and here's what would happen if a solar storm hit Earth in 2024. So, how could something like this happen anyway? Well, it all starts with the cycle of our sun. Known as the solar cycle, this is an 11-year stretch in which the sun's solar activity increases and decreases. The cycle starts with just a few sunspots raging about and creating mass amounts of energy, and then 5 or 6 years later it reaches its peak with anywhere from 100 to 200 sunspots. Then it ramps back down for the last 5 years and we start another solar cycle. Currently, we're in our 25th cycle since we began tracking the sun in 1755. And unfortunately for us, scientists predict that the sunspots will peak in 2024. This means there's a higher chance that a solar storm will occur. Now, before we get to our solar storm, what are sunspots anyway? Well, they're cooler and darker areas of the sun that are created by a strong magnetic field. They're not directly responsible for creating solar flares, but it just so happens that flares are most common in these sunspots due to their high magnetic activity. The magnetic field lines can become twisted and tangled near certain parts of the sun, and they can suddenly snap and realign, which creates a massive burst of energy. This can result in a solar storm. So now that the sun has released this massive amount of energy, what will happen to you on Earth? Well, when a solar storm occurs, you won't notice it right away. That's because it takes a few minutes before it reaches Earth. Hurry up and get in your last couple of YouTube videos because once this storm hits, everything changes. Now, the first thing you might notice is that more and more auroras will start popping up worldwide. This typically happens when charged particles from the solar storm interact with the Earth's atmosphere. Although these sights in the sky look beautiful, the good parts about a solar flare end there. Due to the effect on our geomagnetic field, most of our technology would stop working. Things like satellites, GPS, and radio transmissions would become incredibly spotty. Your cell phone likely wouldn't be able to pick up any signal, and communications worldwide would start to fade out or become less reliable. But that would only be if we were affected by a few solar flares. This is an entire solar storm we're talking about here. These are comprised of multiple attacks by the sun on the Earth. But before we get to that, people on Earth aren't the only ones affected by this. Astronauts up in space would also suffer the consequences. Their situation could be a lot worse. The sun would be blasting them with intense solar radiation, and if they're not in a specially shielded area on the spaceship, a solar storm could prove deadly. They could get radiation sickness, as well as develop cancer later on. The solar storm could also destroy their ability to communicate with their mission control, and vice versa. This is just what would happen on the first day of the solar storm, but several days later, As you're still having trouble getting cell reception, another massive attack would come from the sun. A phenomenon known as a coronal mass ejection, or CME for short, would be coming right for Earth. A CME is a massive explosion of plasma and electromagnetic radiation from the sun. This mass ejection can cause violent geomagnetic storms that interfere with Earth's magnetic field. If this were to happen, Earth as we know it could change for good. Just look at what happened in 1859. A solar storm known as the Carrington event occurred. It disrupted and flat out destroyed telegraph communications. Luckily, in this case, Earth was able to recover relatively quickly from what today would be a cataclysmic event. Telegraph communications were a simple technology. Telegraph lines could be repaired quickly and things went back to normal. But what would happen today? Our lives are so much more reliant on technology, and we have so much more of it. This time, the tech interruptions wouldn't just stop with the odd glitch or spotty signal. Instead, a solar storm could be so bad that it would make all technology stop working. Yeah, the intense levels of electromagnetic radiation could wipe out entire power grids and communication systems. Even something as simple as buying groceries with your credit card would be impossible. We're talking about a full-on global blackout. If you were in an airplane, the cockpit could lose communication with air traffic control and not know where to go. Or, with the intense radiation levels hitting Earth, the plane could fall entirely. The same goes for subways and trains. They could come to a complete stop in their tracks. This would cause catastrophes all around the world. Planes falling from the sky, trains crashing. Now, not having power at your house would be the least of the world's worries, because entire cities, including all hospitals, would be without power. No power means it's harder or impossible to treat certain patients. The lack of power and technology malfunctions could cause millions of people to die. The solar flares and CMEs might last anywhere from a couple of hours to a few days, but that doesn't mean this event would be over just yet. Because of all the damage to our power grids, communications, and technology, Earth would take some time to recover. It might be weeks or months before we get back to normal. We'd have to rebuild parts of our power grids and communication systems. And depending on the parts needed, well, this might take another several weeks. And take into account the lack of communication that the world would suffer. I mean, talking to your neighbors is one thing, but how would you communicate with another city or country? Global supply chains would collapse. This would delay things even further. But once humanity got all these things sorted, we would rebuild. What once felt like the end of humanity might turn into a simple footnote in Earth's history. The result of a solar storm could be traumatic and life-changing, but humans would live to see another day. So, how likely is something like this? Well, it's tough to predict. We can look at the solar cycles and see how many solar flares occur, but there's no telling if they'll hit Earth or not. And although a solar storm could happen, well, keep in mind that even though we're more reliant on technology than ever before, our technology is also more resistant. Communication technology and power grids are built to withstand various types of interference. NASA is also working on technology to help predict and warn us about solar flares. If one is headed our way, well, here's what you can do to prepare. Keep a well-stocked emergency and first aid kit nearby. Like with any natural disaster, it's important to be equipped with first aid equipment, non-perishable food, and water. You might want to invest in surge protectors and remember to unplug any electronics if a solar storm occurs. Lastly, look into off-grid power supplies, backup energy sources like generators or solar panels. Then just wait it out. The world should return to normal. But what if it never did? It starts with a simple cough. And before you know it, millions of people are infected. And it won't stop there. It could keep growing and growing until billions of people are sick. Flights are canceled, cities are quarantined, and hospitals are flooded with patients. This is what's known as a global pandemic. Could we experience something like this? How would a pandemic affect civilization? How does something like this happen? And how could you avoid it? This is What If, and here's what would happen if we had a worldwide pandemic. A worldwide pandemic like this wouldn't be new to the human race. It happened in 1918 and was known as the Spanish flu. It infected about 1/3 of the global population and killed an estimated 50 million people. So, before we start completely freaking out about the end of the world, you can take a bit of comfort in knowing this most likely doesn't mean the end of civilization. But that doesn't mean there won't be consequences. Before we get to what might happen, how does a pandemic start anyway? Well, widely spread epidemics in the past, like the Spanish flu, as well as SARS in 2003, began with a strain of influenza, or the flu. Now, there are two main types of influenza. Type A, which typically comes from animals, including birds, cats, pigs, and horses, and Type B viruses, which are only common among humans. The symptoms of a virus like this are things we've all experienced: runny nose, fever, headache, and just general cold symptoms. But in other cases, influenza can also result in respiratory issues, kidney failure, or even death. But keep in mind, those aren't guaranteed to happen. A disease like this could infect over 2.5 billion people. Why so many? Well, the main thing about these influenza strains is that they can be carried through the air. If someone has it and breathes in your direction, you could breathe in microscopic water droplets carrying the virus. Or if you touch a surface that has the virus on it and then touch your face, you could also catch the disease. You might not even feel the symptoms of influenza right away. It could take a few hours or even up to 2 weeks. This means you could be interacting with people as usual and unknowingly be infecting them. And today, the world is a lot different than it was during 1918's Spanish flu. In addition to the world's population being much higher, we also live very differently. Cities are more dense, with places like Mumbai having over 76,000 people per square mile. With people living closer together, it means we can infect each other more easily. Not only that, but we travel the world with ease now. People who unknowingly carry a virus can quickly bring it to the other side of the world. If this new virus were to spread to just a single person, who spread it to another single person, and another, and another, as time went on, it would eventually infect millions. As people got infected, planes would be grounded and entire countries could be quarantined. If it got bad enough, we might not even be able to leave our homes due to the risk of infecting people or getting infected ourselves. Getting help at a hospital could be difficult too. With billions of people infected, it's unlikely hospitals would be able to care for everyone. If we're dealing with a pandemic that spreads the same way as the Spanish flu did, we could anticipate anywhere between 200 to 425 million deaths. And that's out of the approximately 2.5 billion people who would be infected. But how likely is it that a scenario like this will happen? Well, it's hard to say. Experts say that humanity is due for a massive pandemic. It happened 100 years ago with the Spanish flu, and before that, with the bubonic plague in 1347. Unfortunately, pandemics like these are just a reality of human civilization. But that doesn't mean a pandemic today would be as bad as the Spanish flu. Although the disease might spread more efficiently than ever before, it also might be easier than ever to cure it. Although a pandemic implies that you'll have little immunity to it, doctors could develop a vaccine for it. Today, with increased technology and communication being more seamless than ever, the world's scientists could work together. You could have doctors in New York talking with researchers in China, trying to solve a pandemic. It definitely wouldn't be easy and could take up to a year, but eventually a vaccine could be invented. The next issue would be how it gets distributed. If countries aren't willing to work together and distribute the vaccines fairly, it could cause some serious conflict. But assuming they all do work together, it could eventually stop the pandemic. Hopefully, something like this won't happen in the first place. After all, we're now better at monitoring animals and their diseases than ever before. And by knowing the consequences of a real pandemic, hopefully we can stop the spread of infections before they go any further. So, how can you avoid something like this? Well, according to health experts, the rules are pretty simple. Similar to avoiding the common cold, you should wash your hands a lot and keep away from people coughing and sneezing. And if you're feeling sick, you should definitely see a doctor right away. Also, would you please cough or sneeze into a tissue or an elbow? So, although everybody doesn't have to die in this scenario, it would have a severe impact on people. And if the world isn't willing to work and cooperate together, the realities of a new pandemic could be pretty grim. Whoa, watch your head! Some seriously big asteroids are crashing into Earth. What kind of shapes and sizes do they have? Which ones would have the deadliest impact? And which one would be most likely to hit us? Uh-oh, get your bunker ready. This is What If, and here's what would happen if the largest asteroid hit Earth. Okay, let's get the terminology out of the way. I say asteroids, but some of the objects on our list are not asteroids. They're comets. Both asteroids and comets are objects in our solar system, but they aren't the same. Asteroids are rocky leftovers from the early formation of our planetary neighborhood. And of the over 1 million that we know of, most orbit the Sun in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. On the other hand, comets are snowballs made of frozen gases, rock, and dust. They orbit the Sun, and when they get too close, they start to melt. This releases a giant cloud of dust and gas that can be larger than most planets. With 3,000 known comets in the solar system, could a few be ready to turn the Earth into a giant cloud of dust too? Chelyabinsk meteorite. Let's start with a smaller object that has already hit our planet. Meet the Chelyabinsk meteorite. It exploded over Russia in February of 2013. With a diameter of about 17 meters, it was relatively small, but the impact was huge. The explosion had the energetic equivalent of 500,000 tons of TNT. That's about 30 times as powerful as the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. It injured 1,200 people and caused enormous property damage. Pretty big effects from a little extraterrestrial visitor. Chicxulub. Moving on to something bigger, we'll go 65 million years into the past. The massive Chicxulub asteroid was likely one of the forces that resulted in the mass extinction of the dinosaurs. It was about 10 to 15 kilometers wide, and its impact crater in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula measures 180 kilometers wide and 900 meters deep. Whoa! When this asteroid slammed into Earth, it devastated everything nearby. The blast wave sent enormous amounts of rocky material into the atmosphere, and it caused tsunamis as high as 1,500 meters. While all the soot didn't completely block out the sun, it reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the surface of our planet. That seriously devastated plant growth and had rippling consequences on the food chain. Eventually, it caused entire ecosystems to collapse. Oumuamua. Of all the objects that could collide with us, Oumuamua has one of the more interesting shapes. This rocky, cigar-shaped object is about 400 meters in length. NASA classifies it as a comet, but it exhibits traits of an asteroid too. And it doesn't have an attachment to any star system, so we don't know where in space it originates from. In 2017, it passed by the Earth at a distance of 41 million kilometers. Now, while we were safe from impact on that occasion, it could have resulted in a lot of destruction. If this interstellar guest crashed into Earth, darkness would cover our planet. And if the dust and debris stayed in our atmosphere for a long time, it would kill many plants, animals, and humans that depend on the sun. Bennu. Bennu is not only an asteroid you should worry about, it's the asteroid you should worry about. It has a 1 in 1,700 chance of colliding with Earth in September of the year 2182. At only half a kilometer wide, it's relatively small, but remember how significant the Chelyabinsk impact was? Yeah, with that in mind, you might be a little nervous when it makes a close approach to Earth every 6 years. Shoemaker-Levy 9. This next comet doesn't have any chance of hitting Earth. That's because it already collided with Jupiter in 1994. But you could imagine the destruction this 1.5 to 2 kilometer wide comet would have caused on our home turf. It broke into 20 pieces as a result of Jupiter's gravity. The collisions from these fragments were so powerful that they were similar to the detonations of about 300 million atomic bombs. And the atmosphere heated to scorching temperatures of 30,000 to 40,000 degrees. You must be pretty relieved that Shoemaker-Levy 9 never hit us. Ceres. Last, but far from the least, is an asteroid so big it's technically classified as a dwarf planet. Ceres is the largest object in the asteroid belt. It makes up 25% of the belt's total mass. The radius of Ceres is 476 kilometers. That makes it over 60 times larger than our ancient friend Chicxulub. If Ceres collided with Earth, there wouldn't just be devastation. There would be no Earth. The size of Ceres alone would block out the sun as it approached. And then, the impact would remove 10 kilometers of the Earth's crust. Hypersonic shockwaves would ripple across the globe. Everything in its path would be incinerated and leveled. Nothing would stand a chance of surviving. Our planet would essentially turn into a glowing ball of fire and melted rock. If by some miracle or secret underground bunker you survived, well, you wouldn't last long. Soot in the atmosphere would result in something like a nuclear winter. Ice caps on both poles of the planet are melting. And not just a few, all of them. If all this ice melted, it would be catastrophic. How much would the sea levels rise? How would this impact global temperatures? And what would this mean for life on Earth? This is What If, and here's what would happen if all the world's ice melted. Sea levels are rising around the globe at around 4.8 millimeters every year. Glaciers and ice sheets are melting due to global warming. And climate scientists estimate that the average temperature on Earth could increase from the current 14 degrees Celsius to 27 degrees Celsius. At this pace, you would witness devastating floods on coastal lands, and parts of the world would be entirely lost to the sea. But if all the world's ice melted away, things would go south fast. Hey, since we're talking about ice, let's start with a cold, hard fact. If all the world's glaciers and ice sheets melted, sea levels would rise an astonishing 65 meters. All over the world, countries with an elevation below this level would cease to exist. Farewell to the Maldives, Singapore, and Denmark. Sorry you never got to visit them. The 37 million people living in those areas would have to evacuate and head for higher elevations. And fast. And a lot of the populated coastlines around the world would have to be evacuated too. In North America, the entire Atlantic seaboard would vanish. That means Disney World in Florida wouldn't be a small world, it would be an underwater world. On the West Coast, the hills of San Francisco would become a cluster of islands, and the Golden Gate Bridge would stick out from the sea until it rusts away and disappears into the ocean. Millions of people in the United States would lose their home and move further inland. If you live in Denver, Colorado, your home city might be bustling. In South America, the Amazon and Paraguay River basins would become inlets for the Atlantic Ocean. And big urban centers like Buenos Aires or Montevideo would disappear. Europe would say goodbye to many of its cities. Venice would become a modern-day Atlantis, and London's Big Ben would now strike midnight from underwater. Large parts of Asia would be devastated by the swelling seas. Nearly 800 million people would lose their homes in China, India, and Bangladesh. Australia could become more hospitable as an inland sea develops, but it would be bad news for the 80% of Australians living on the coastal strip. You'd be the lucky one if you lived in Africa, where large parts of land would be spared from global flooding. Unfortunately, the world would lose one of the ancient wonders, the Great Pyramid of Giza. It would be swamped by the Mediterranean. But flooding of the continents would only be the tip of the iceberg. The world would also lose 90% of its fresh water. Yeah, this is how much is stored in the Antarctic ice sheet. This ice water would mix with the ocean and dramatically disrupt its salt levels. Many aquatic animals that have evolved to live in salt water would go extinct. Diluted water would also impact the ocean currents. The Gulf Stream, which brings warm air to northern Europe, would become weak or even stop. And this would make temperatures plummet in that region. And there's more bad news. The glacial freshwater stores some toxic chemicals like DDT, and the Arctic permafrost has as much mercury as everywhere else on the planet combined. As these toxic chemicals and elements ended up at rivers, lakes, and groundwater reserves, they would poison many people. The melting of the permafrost would also be a feast for microorganisms that feed on the organic matter frozen inside. These organisms will, pardon my French, fart out a lot of greenhouse gases that could cause a global temperature rise of 3.5 degrees Celsius. Listen, most of life on Earth would not survive this disaster, but I have good news for you. Scientists estimate that all of the Earth's ice wouldn't melt overnight. If climate change keeps going at the same rate, it will take 5,000 years. But if we begin to make serious changes to our climate policies, maybe we could avoid it altogether. Right now, in the United States, one of the world's largest volcanoes is gearing up to explode. It's known as the Yellowstone volcano. And it's not just any regular volcano. Nope. It's a supervolcano. If Yellowstone decided to erupt, the results would be devastating. But how bad would they be? Is there anything we can do to stop it? Would it affect the entire world? And how would this change our weather? This is What If, and here's what would happen if the Yellowstone volcano erupted tomorrow. Located in Wyoming in the United States, Yellowstone has erupted 3 times in the past 2 million years. This has led some people to wonder whether we should be worried about another Yellowstone eruption in the near future. And by near future, we mean probably in another couple 100,000 years. But instead of waiting so long, why don't we find out what would happen if the eruption took place tomorrow? If you live in North America, there would be virtually nothing you could do to prepare. Now that this supervolcano has exploded, well, first, what makes Yellowstone a supervolcano anyway? Well, apart from it being larger in size, a supervolcano also produces a much more massive explosion. Most of the time, when we think of a volcanic eruption, we think of the hot, molten lava spewing down, covering the surrounding area. Well, while that would happen at Yellowstone, and it is something you'd need to worry about, it wouldn't be the only thing. In fact, the lava pouring out of the volcano might be the least of your worries. Surprisingly, there wouldn't be much of it. At least not as much as you'd expect from a supervolcano. That's because before lava leaves a volcano, it's first known as magma. But in this case, a lot of Yellowstone's magma won't be able to become lava. That's because it will be shot up into the sky, becoming airborne ash particles. And it won't just be any type of ash. These will be tiny, scorching little particles of jagged rock. Now this would affect nearly the entire United States and Canada. Tens of millions of people within 1,000 kilometers of the eruption would die. If you breathed the ash, which would be inevitable in a scenario like this, it would form a cement-like mixture in your lungs, causing you to suffocate. Buildings would collapse as just 30 centimeters of ash is enough to cave roofs in. And you'd still be in trouble even if you were outside that 1,000 kilometer range. Experts say that even the east coast of the United States would be covered with 1 centimeter of ash, which would still be incredibly dangerous to our human lungs. Even parts of Europe would see some ash, maybe a light dusting. And that wouldn't be the only effect they'd experience. Apart from the deadly ash everywhere, the entire world would experience a temperature drop. The ash lingering in the air would block out the sun, resulting in significant weather changes. The global temperature would drop by 10 degrees, an effect which could last as long as a decade. World. So, although you'd probably survive the initial explosion, you'd eventually suffer the consequences of the ash. Whether that means dying relatively quickly or living long enough to experience a colder, harsher world. Luckily, you can take a deep breath of ashless oxygen knowing that something like this will probably never happen, at least not in our lifetime. An eruption like this at Yellowstone would be known as a supervolcanic eruption. A more likely explosion at Yellowstone would be a hydrothermal eruption. This mainly involves a lot of steam and some rocks hurtling through the air. Although something like this would be bad, it wouldn't be nearly as scary as what we're getting here. A more likely eruption at Yellowstone would be a relatively simple lava flow. In fact, since the last major explosion, 600,000 years ago, we've had nearly 50 of these eruptions and 0 casualties. Absolute zero is the lowest possible temperature in the universe. Nothing gets colder than that. So, if the entire Earth suddenly cooled down to it would this temperature. And what's the coolest thing about it? This is what if. And here's what would happen if the Earth dropped to absolute zero for 5 seconds. Temperature is how we measure kinetic energy of the particles in any object. Yeah, it tells us how fast atoms, molecules, and particles move. The hotter a gas, liquid, or solid gets, the faster the particles move. And when that movement slows down, the colder that substance becomes. At the lowest temperature possible, or absolute zero, particles stop moving altogether. This is because at 0 Kelvin, or minus 273.15 degrees Celsius, no heat energy remains. The coldest ground temperature ever on Earth, 184 Kelvin, or minus 89.2 degrees Celsius, was recorded in Antarctica in 1983. But even the coldest 5,000 light years away from Earth is just a tad warmer at just 5 seconds ever? At room temperature, that comfortable range of temperatures of about 293 Kelvin, the air molecules move at an average speed of 1,800 kilometers per hour. As the temperatures on Earth suddenly plummeted, all those particles would slow down. At 0.00001 Kelvin, the atomic particles would be moving at a speed of about 0.18 kilometers per hour. That's 1,000 times slower than their speed at room temperature. Getting this close to absolute zero, all chemical reactions would be closer and closer to coming to a complete stop. Body. Without the trillions of chemical reactions going on inside of you, you wouldn't be able to breathe or turn food into fuel. Toasty 77 Kelvin, you'd be in serious trouble. That's the temperature of liquid nitrogen. After just a few seconds of exposure to this temperature, you'd suffer severe burns, blistering, and frostbite. Needing a toe or 10 amputated could be a definite possibility. So, just 5 seconds of absolute zero could do incredible amounts of damage to all life forms on Earth. But I have good news. The chemical reactions wouldn't come to a total standstill. Even at the near absolute zero temperature of the Boomerang Nebula, chemical reactions do still appear to take place. This is thanks to the strange effects of quantum physics. And whenever quantum physics is involved, things get weird. With all the atoms on Earth at a near standstill, you'd find them starting to clump together. They'd be forming a state of matter known as a Bose-Einstein condensate. This would mean that every atom is in the same energy state and essentially identical to one another from a physical point of view. They'd start to behave as a single atom. And if you could become a Bose-Einstein condensate, it would be pretty cool, pardon the pun. For those brief 5 seconds, you'd have some unique physical properties, like superfluidity. Yeah, you'd be able to flow through tiny cracks without any friction. Only there wouldn't be any cracks because you wouldn't be the only superfluid thing on the planet. But there is a catch. Bose-Einstein condensates can only be formed when bosons are cooled to near absolute zero. Bosons are all atoms with an even number of electrons. That means only some of the atoms in your body and the environment around you could become a Bose-Einstein condensate. And lucky for you, reaching a temperature of absolute zero wouldn't be possible. If Earth and everything on it plummeted to absolute zero, it would instantly pull the heat from the space around it. To keep you and the planet at 0 degrees Kelvin, even for 5 seconds, you'd need an infinite amount of resources. This makes it mathematically impossible. Our planet would turn into. Today, we're dropping a massive bomb into the Mariana Trench. But we're not stopping there. We're also going to nuke a hurricane and a volcano. Let's start our nuclear experiment by dropping a nuke into the Mariana Trench. How would you deliver a nuke to the bottom of the Mariana Trench? What would this underwater explosion be like? And what kind of destruction would it cause? This is What If, and here's what would happen if we nuked the Mariana Trench. Welcome to the deepest, darkest depths of the ocean. The Mariana Trench is located in the western Pacific Ocean, just 360 kilometers away from the island of Guam. You'll be traveling down 11 kilometers to Challenger Deep, the deepest point of the trench. Here, you could stack about 30 Empire State Buildings on top of each other before hitting the surface. You'd be among the brave few to venture into these high-pressure, pitch-black, and near-freezing waters. Joining the company of scientists, a naval officer, and even filmmaker James Cameron. But you'll be carrying the most precious cargo of all. The biggest nuclear bomb ever made. Okay, wait, before you worry about what would happen if you exploded a bomb at the bottom of the trench, you'd want to figure out how to get it there safely. If a bomb accidentally exploded near the surface, it could be dangerous for many people. You could think of it as a massive nuclear tsunami. Waves hundreds of meters high, spreading out in all directions. This could create a hazardous situation for the islands neighboring the Mariana Trench, like Guam, Japan, or the Philippines. Luckily, these waves would behave differently than your regular tsunami waves. They would break earlier. That means they'd be smaller and less catastrophic when they reached land. But still, better to avoid this crisis and get that bomb safely down into the trench. To do this, you'd have to protect it from extremely high pressures. At the bottom of the trench, the pressure is so high, it would be like having 100 adult elephants on your head. You'd want to use a special pressure vessel to transport the bomb, just like Operation Wigwam. In 1955, the United States detonated a bomb at a depth of 600 meters. It was twice as powerful as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The explosion generated a massive bubble across the water, and deadly radioactive contamination spread across 13 square kilometers. But your bomb would be the largest nuke ever created. More like the Tsar Bomba. This nuclear weapon was over 3,000 times more powerful than Little Boy, the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. And you'd have to take it much, much deeper than the wigwam test. At the moment of detonation, a bubble of hot steam would expand rapidly. In just a few seconds, it would cover an area of about 1 kilometer. On the surface, you'd see a massive bulge in the water. But it wouldn't reach great heights. That's because you would detonate the bomb so deep that the water pressure above would cause the bubble to collapse. But within a few seconds, that bubble would shrink, then start to expand outward again. This expansion and contraction would continue for 3 or 4 cycles. This would leave the water turbulent, hot, and mixed with radioactive debris. At least no neighboring coastal cities would have to worry about being wiped out by a tsunami. But you certainly wouldn't see the effects ending there. The increased temperatures from the explosion could create intense hurricanes. And the turbulent waters and radioactive material would have adverse effects on marine life. There would be mass casualties from the explosion. And deep sea fish could be blinded by the bright flash of light. Over time, you could see unexpected or surprising effects on the ecosystem near the detonation site. There are corals as big as cars after the 23 detonations at the US nuclear testing site on Bikini Atoll, not to mention an abundance of aquatic animal life. But you could see mutations of marine life after a while. Now, that's what would happen if we nuked the Mariana Trench, but let's move our nuclear weapons from the sea all the way to the sky. Let's nuke a hurricane. Every year, about 6 hurricanes reach the United States, with effects ranging from heavy winds and some flooding to the decimation of communities, destroying homes and taking lives. Instead of bracing for impact with our sandbags and survival kits, what if hurricanes never hit land at all? What if we could stop these hurricanes by nuking them? How would we do it? Could this cause a nuclear apocalypse? Or would a bomb even stop a hurricane? This is What If, and here's what would happen if we nuked a hurricane. But first, what exactly are hurricanes? Well, they're massive storms that form over warm ocean water near the equator. Hurricanes are tropical storms. The water they form over needs to be above 26 degrees for them to work. This warm water creates humid air, which then gets thrust upwards by tropical winds to create storm clouds. Lighter winds outside the clouds steer them and help them grow. This cycle keeps happening until the storm has winds of at least 119 kilometers per hour. At that point, it's called a hurricane. They're usually about 160 kilometers in diameter and can be nearly as large as the state of Texas. Oh yeah, and did we mention that these things can last for days? You definitely don't want this coming to your home, so let's nuke it. Believe it or not, the idea of nuking hurricanes isn't new. It's been proposed for decades, dating back to the 1950s. The idea works like this. A submarine would travel underwater to below the eye of the storm. Once there, the sub would launch the nuclear bomb, creating an explosion intended to blast out all the hot air and bring in cold air, which is denser. The cold air would slow down the wind and stop the hurricane. Okay, we have our nuke and are ready to launch it. There it goes. And, well, nothing happened. The hurricane is still there. That can't be good. The reason nothing would happen is because of the amount of energy a hurricane produces. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the heat released from a hurricane is equal to a 10-megaton nuclear bomb exploding every 20 minutes. In 1990, all of humanity used 20% less energy than a single hurricane produces. So the average bombs of today would hardly make a dent on a hurricane. Not only that, the hurricane would carry all that radiation, plutonium, and other civilization-destroying materials from the air down to the land. As if a regular hurricane wasn't bad enough, we'd now have a radioactive one. As it moved across America, it would destroy cities with its wind and water while also dumping radiation on them. Okay, let's try this again. This time, we'll use an even bigger bomb. And we mean really big. To have enough energy and force to stop a hurricane, you'd need more than 100 atomic bombs. But to keep it simple, let's pack all that power into one giant bomb. If we released such a massive bomb, it would surely stop the most epic of hurricanes. But once the dust settles, you'd quickly realize that you destroyed most of the Earth in the process. So, whichever way you attempt it, nuking a hurricane is not a good idea. And, unfortunately, the number of hurricanes continues to increase. Researchers say that the warming of the oceans due to climate change is a reason why hurricanes are getting stronger and more frequent. And no, we can't nuke that problem either. So, nuking a hurricane is a terrible idea. Okay, for our last hypothetical experiment, let's try putting these nukes to good use by detonating them inside of a volcano. What happens next? Volcanoes. The ultimate natural force of destruction. They're unforgiving, uncompromising, and unstoppable. About 1,500 volcanoes around the world are considered to be active, with more than 10% of them in the United States. Is there any way we could stop them before the destruction begins? Could we literally fight fire with fire? What if we nuked an active volcano? Would it solve the problem? Or make it way worse? This is What If, and here's what would happen if we nuked an active volcano. Volcanoes are as cool as they are terrifying. They are an incredible force of nature, capable of destroying our lives on their path of destruction. But could we give them a taste of their own medicine? How could we nuke such a fiery inferno? Well, we'd need to bring out the big guns. The nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Japan during World War II was the equivalent of over 130 million kilograms of TNT. That had plenty of impact. Could we use something like it to blow a volcano to smithereens? First, we'd have to figure out the target. While it's difficult to predict when a volcano will erupt, there are some warning signs. Watch for things like tiny earthquakes, releases of steam and other gases from the volcano's mouth, and bulging from the sides. Sounds like my last date. That being said, whether the volcano will erupt is still a massive educated guess. So let's say that our scientists locked on to an active volcano that's ready to blow. It would be a miracle if they could coordinate with the military fast enough to try and stop it. Ideally, we'd be able to predict it a few days before the volcano was about to explode. This would provide more than enough time for people to pack up their belongings and evacuate without causing the kinds of highway traffic jams we see during hurricanes, tsunamis, and other disasters. With everyone out of harm's way, geologists, volcanologists, and weapons experts would determine any weak spots on a volcano's sides that could be hit effectively. Next, a highly trained crew of pilots would fly over the volcano, drop their payload, and get the heck out of Dodge. If things worked perfectly, as in if they used the exact right amount of explosives and hit the perfect spot in exactly the right way, the top of the volcano would crumble into itself, keeping the magma mostly underground. There might still be some seepage around the base of the volcano, but it wouldn't be anything like how the eruption would have played out naturally. But if we're being honest, it would be like trying to put out fire with gasoline. Geologists warn that trying to bomb a volcano might actually make things worse. A lot worse. The explosion of the bomb, mixed with the buildup of pressure inside a volcano, could amplify the eruption. The force would release even more ash and lava, spreading it even further than it would have gone with the volcano's own power. And that's if we managed to hit the target. If the nuke missed its target, there's still a nuclear bomb being dropped in an area where people live, or at least near enough that they would feel the effects of the radiation. If you had to pick one, which would you choose? Death by lava or nuclear destruction?
What would happen if the largest country on Earth decided it needs more territory and power? Well, it might just go to war over it. What country could Russia invade first? What would be the plan of attack? And what's the most dangerous weapon in Russia's possession? This is What If? And here's what would happen if Russia started a war. Russia already takes up 1/8 of all the inhabited land on the planet, and now it has its eyes on one of its European neighbors, Ukraine. Historically, Ukraine and Russia have been in conflicts before. Most recently, Russia annexed the Ukrainian peninsula Crimea, and then it backed a separatist rebellion in eastern Ukraine. Now, Russia doesn't want Ukraine cozying up to NATO. It wants NATO out of Eastern Europe, period. And even though Russia isn't a member of NATO to make decisions on such things, with one of the most powerful militaries in the world, Russia might feel like it can play by its own rules. Okay, let's back up a little. First, you might be wondering what NATO is. Well, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and right now it includes 30 members. The United States, Canada, Netherlands, and the United Kingdom are among them. NATO's goal is to keep the peace and make sure no member of this alliance gets invaded by an international military force. You know, like that time Russia took Crimea from Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is not yet a member of NATO, but it has shown interest in joining it. And that doesn't sit well with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin is already a little freaked out that NATO is training Ukrainian troops and some members are supplying its army with weapons. So he's decided to go about it with the good old method of persuasion. He's threatening to start a war. Now, with a defense budget of $42 billion, Russia puts a lot of love and money into its military. Russia's army counts 3.5 million recruits. And it has tanks. 13,000 of them. No other country in the world has this many. Russia also has 27,000 armored vehicles and ranks first in the world with its 4,465 artillery guns. And then there's also Russia's nukes to worry about. All 6,257 of them. These can be launched from aircraft, subs, or missiles. But if Russia decided to attack, chances are it wouldn't start on land. No, the first strike would likely come from the air. This could level electricity stations and bridges, obliterate rail lines, and cripple the economy of any country attacked. In addition to this, Russia's naval fleet is nearly unmatchable. Their nuclear-powered submarines alone, parked along a coastline, could pose enough of a threat to anyone thinking about taking them on. Depending who the targeted country is, of course. If Russia attacked Ukraine, NATO would likely respond with heavy economic sanctions. But Russia has allies of its own. It's a member of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO. This is a group of 6 former Soviet states in a NATO-like alliance. It also has Cuba in its corner. And if things should get really testy, Cuba would be a key hub for Russian troops looking to do some damage on US soil. It's pretty scary when 100,000 Russian troops are standing on your doorstep. But this likely wouldn't be a war to wipe out the country. Chances are, Russia has something to gain from it. It might be natural resources or political leverage. Whatever it is, the plan wouldn't be to obliterate every target in its way, only to do enough damage to make their point. In the case of Ukraine, it could shut down the Ukrainian economy. But they could do that with minimal forces on the ground. War is also not fought the same way it was even a decade ago. It can be much more covert. Hack attack, anyone? Now, if you worry about those Russian nukes, well, I might have an idea of how to rid the world of them. How about nuking a volcano? In the name of science. Go on, see what happens. Now, that's a story for another What If. It's been 30 days since Uranus first appeared in the sky. At first, it looked like our moon had found itself a stellar partner.